In the raw autumn of 1884, along the wind-scoured edge of Willow Fork Valley in the Montana Territory, while every other homesteader within 30 miles was busy with the honest labor of survival, chinking log walls with clay, doubling roof timbers, and hammering together tall plank windbreaks that could take the punch of a northern gale, Isaiah Renfrow was doing something no reasonable man could explain. He wasn't stacking cordwood. He wasn't packing sod against his cabin base. He wasn't even mending the split shingles above his own front door. Instead, from the first cold morning of October onward, he could be seen walking slow, patient circles around his homestead with a coil of hemp rope over one shoulder, a leather satchel of measuring pegs at his hip, and a bundle of thin young spruce saplings dragging behind him on a canvas sled. He planted them one at a time, never in a straight line, never in an even row. Sometimes only 6 feet apart, sometimes nearly 9. Sometimes he would stop, kneel down, squint toward the ridge in the north, then dig up a sapling he had just planted and move it 3 paces sideways. Nothing about the pattern made sense to the eye, yet nothing about it looked careless either. Every hole, every angle, every gap between the young trees seemed measured by a private logic only Isaiah himself carried inside his head. Inside the cabin were the two people who depended on that logic most: his wife Cordelia, 4 months along with their second child, and their 6-year-old daughter, Josephine, who trailed after her father in a wool coat 2 sizes too big, carrying pegs whenever her small hands could grip them. Cordelia would stand at the doorway some afternoons, one palm cradling the low curve of her belly, watching him place another sapling into ground that was already beginning to freeze at dusk. She never questioned him in front of Josephine, but at night, when the wind slid down out of the bitterroots and pressed against the shutters, she would sit near the stove with her sewing untouched in her lap, staring at the door as if trying to understand the man on the other side of it. Travelers on the wagon road slowed their teams just to look. A cattleman named Horace Blaine rode past twice in the same week and shook his head both times. A pair of Mennonite brothers hauling flour to the mill stopped their wagon entirely, stared for a long minute, and then drove on without a word. Word spread quickly along the valley, the way word always did in country where entertainment was scarce. Isaiah Renfrow, they said, had lost his good sense. Isaiah Renfrow was planting a garden in October. Isaiah Renfrow was going to freeze his wife and child inside a cabin that wasn't half ready for winter, and all because he'd chosen to spend his last warm weeks putting sticks in the dirt instead of firewood against the wall. What none of them could see was that the gaps between the saplings mattered as much to Isaiah as the saplings themselves. He wasn't building a wall. He wasn't even building a fence. He was building something stranger, something that had no name in the plain speech of the valley, something he had carried in his head for nearly a decade without ever having the ground or the courage to try it. To the people passing on the road, it looked like a man wagering the lives of his wife and daughter, an unborn child, on a fool's daydream. And if he was wrong, the Montana winter would not be a forgiving judge. What did Isaiah Renfrow know that his neighbors did not? What secret lived inside the spacing of those thin, half-frozen spruce trees? Would his strange design cradle his family through the worst blizzard the territory had seen in a generation? Or would it become the frozen coffin his neighbors were already whispering about around their supper tables? Subscribe now, because what happened in Willow Fork Valley that winter would not only test one man's silent theory against the fury of the northern plains, it would rewrite what every homesteader in 3 counties believed about how a family survives a storm. The first visitor to speak plainly about what he saw came on a raw Tuesday afternoon in the second week of October. His name was Coulter Vance, a freight hauler who had been running goods between the Bitterroot settlements and the mining camps north of Helena for close to 20 years. He was a wide-shouldered man with a face burned red by 3 decades of prairie sun and a beard that had gone the color of iron shavings. He knew wind. He knew snow. He knew, better than most, what a Montana January could do to a cabin that hadn't been braced properly for it. When his wagon crested the low rise above Willow Fork and he saw the strange rings of young spruce standing around the Renfrew claim, he pulled his mules to a hard stop and simply sat there for a long moment, saying nothing. Then he climbed down. He did not walk toward the cabin first. He walked toward the outermost ring of saplings, moving slowly, the way an old scout might approach an unfamiliar track in the mud. He stopped at the widest gap between two of the young spruce and studied it. Then he looked north, toward the pass where the winter wind always came through cleanest. Then he looked back at the gap again. His mouth moved once, but no sound came out. Isaiah was on the far side of the cabin, driving another peg into the frozen ground with a wooden mallet. Cordelia had stepped onto the porch when she heard the wagon, and Josephine peeked from behind her mother's skirt with wide, curious eyes. Coulter finally raised his voice, not unkindly, but with the flat weight of a man who had watched too many homesteads fail. "Renfrew," he called across the yard, "you know what a hard drift does to a cabin like yours." Isaiah did not stop swinging the mallet. He gave a small nod without looking up. Coulter walked closer until he stood only a few paces from the porch. His eyes traveled along the strange curved line of saplings, then across the meager wood pile stacked beside the cabin, then back to Cordelia's rounded belly. "Winter of '72, he said quietly. "I hauled supplies to a family up past Bozeman Pass. Husband thought he'd tucked his cabin in tight against a stand of aspen for shelter. 3-day storm blew through. When we got back in April, the drift had climbed clean over the roof. Chimneys sealed shut before the second night. We dug them out with a wagon jack and a coal shovel. Wife had the baby wrapped in every blanket in the house. Both of them gone, the husband still holding the flint like he was trying to light one more fire." The wind moved softly through the spruce needles as he spoke. Josephine had gone very still against her mother's leg. Cordelia's hand tightened almost imperceptibly against the porch rail. Coulter turned his eyes on Isaiah at last. "Snow near a house ain't a friend," he said. "It's a weight that don't stop pressing until something breaks. And what you're doing here, Renfrew, you're inviting it right up to your front door." Isaiah lowered the mallet slowly. He did not look angry. He did not look wounded. He looked, if anything, like a man being handed a warning he had already spoken to himself, many times in the quiet hours before dawn. He met Coulter's gaze evenly. "I hear you, Vance," he said. That was all. Coulter waited, expecting more. When more did not come, he shook his head once, climbed back onto his wagon, and gathered the reins in gloved hands. Before he snapped them, he looked one last time toward Cordelia. "Ma'am," he said, tipping the brim of his hat, "if I'm wrong, I'll be the first to say so come spring. But if I'm right, there won't be anybody left to say it to." Then he clucked to the mules and the wagon rolled away down the wagon road, its wheels leaving pale ruts in the hardening grass. Cordelia stood on the porch long after the sound of the wheels had faded. Isaiah, for his part, went back to swinging the mallet. But the rhythm was slower now, and Josephine noticed it, though she did not know how to name what she was hearing. That night, after Josephine had been coaxed to sleep beneath a quilt Cordelia's mother had stitched back in Ohio, and after the last of the stew had been scraped clean from the iron pot, Isaiah sat down at the rough plank table with a whetstone and a paring knife, and he began to sharpen the point of a spruce peg by lamplight. Cordelia watched him from her chair by the stove, her mending laid across her lap, her hands quiet for once. The wind outside was gentle that evening, almost lazy, but there was a coldness threaded through it that carried the promise of things not yet arrived. "Isaiah," she said at last. Her voice was soft, but it filled the small cabin the way a match fills a dark room. "Are you sure?" He set down the knife. He did not answer right away. He rested his palms flat on the table and looked into the grain of the wood as though the answer might be written somewhere in the knots. Then he lifted his eyes to hers, and Cordelia saw in them something she had not expected to see. Not confidence, not stubbornness, something quieter and more difficult. The look of a man who knew exactly what he was gambling and had chosen to gamble it anyway. "I'm not trying to stop the wind, Delia," he said finally. "A man who thinks he can stop a Montana wind is already halfway to the grave. I'm trying to teach it to move around us." He picked up the sharpened peg and held it lightly between two fingers, turning it in the lamplight. Wind that comes at a wall, that wind fights back. It piles snow. It finds cracks. Hunts for the softest place and it opens it. But wind that gets broken up, wind that gets cut into little pieces before it ever reaches the door, that wind loses its shape. It loses its temper. And once it loses its temper, it can't build a drift the same way. It just runs itself tired. Cordelia was quiet a long moment. And the trees will do that. The trees and the space between them, Isaiah said. It's the space that matters most. Folks think a windbreak is about the trunks. It's not. It's about what happens in the gaps. She wanted to ask him where he had learned such a thing. She had known him for 11 years, had followed him from Iowa to the Dakotas, and from the Dakotas to this raw stretch of Montana Valley, and he had never once spoken of what he was speaking of now. But before she could form the question, he was already answering it, as if he had been carrying the story a long time and only now found a place to lay it down. He told her about the winter of 1874, when he had been 19 years old and working as a chain bearer for a government survey crew mapping the eastern slopes of the Bitterroots. He told her about the storm that had come down out of the mountains on the third night of December that year, a whiteout so complete that the survey camp had lost 2 mules within 30 paces of the cook fire. He told her how the wind had flattened the canvas tents like paper, how the plank windbreak the crew foreman had insisted on building had been ripped from its posts and thrown across the meadow in splinters, how a Norwegian axeman named Haver had frozen to death sitting upright against a supply crate with his hand still gripping the handle of a coffee pot. And then he told her about the cabin. Half a mile above the survey camp, tucked into the shoulder of the ridge, there had stood an old prospector's shack that no one in the crew had thought worth visiting. It was crooked. Its roof sagged. Its stovepipe leaned as though a strong sneeze might tip it. But when the storm finally broke on the 4th morning and the survey men stumbled up the ridge looking for anything they could salvage, they had found that shack still standing. Not merely standing, untouched. Barely adrift against its walls. The wind had passed clean over it as though the shack were not there. Isaiah had walked around it 3 times before he understood. Around the prospector's shack, half swallowed by 10 years of neglect, stood a rough thicket of young pine, not planted, not tended, simply grown up wild from seed that had fallen there long after the shack was built. The trees were crooked. Some leaned so far sideways they looked ready to topple. They were spaced unevenly, with wide holes between some and dense clusters between others. To any surveyor's eye, they were the picture of disorder. But when Isaiah walked among them in the pale gray light of that 4th morning, with the storm finally spent and the snow still whispering against his boots, he had understood something that no book of his had ever taught him. The wind had come off the ridge in its full fury. He could see the drift line where it had crossed the survey camp below, a wall of packed snow taller than a man that had buried the wreckage of the tents. Yet up here, around the shack, the drift line broke apart. It scattered. It rose in strange humps and hollows that made no pattern at first glance, until Isaiah stood at the doorway of the shack itself and looked back the way the wind had come. Then he saw it. The drifts had not been built by the trees blocking the wind. They had been built by the wind losing its grip on itself, tumbling over its own broken pieces, dropping its snow in places it had never meant to drop it, because the trees had scattered it before it could finish its work. The shack sat in a pocket of stillness because the wind had spent its strength trying to get through the thicket, and by the time it emerged on the other side, it had nothing left to give. That was the lesson Isaiah had carried down out of the Bitterroots 10 winters back, and that was the lesson he was trying to give to the ground around his own cabin now. He told Cordelia all of this in a low, steady voice, while the lamp flickered and Josephine murmured something in her sleep. When he was finished, he set the sharpened peg down on the table between them, and he waited. Cordelia looked at the peg for a long time. Then she looked at her husband. "You've been carrying this 10 years, she said quietly. "Why now?" Isaiah's hand drifted, without his seeming to notice, toward the curve of her belly across the table. "Because now I've got 2 people to keep alive under this roof," he said, and by January, God willing, I'll have 3. She did not answer. She only reached across the plank table and laid her hand over his, and they sat like that a long while, saying nothing, while outside the wind sighed through the young spruce and the stove ticked as it cooled. The next morning, before the light had even begun to gray the eastern rim of the valley, Isaiah was up and dressed and out the door with his hemp rope and his measuring pegs. Cordelia stood at the window and watched him walk out into the frost with the sled trailing behind him, another bundle of saplings roped to its canvas bed. She did not know yet whether she believed him. She only knew that whatever he was building for her, and for Josephine, and for the child not yet born, and that had to be enough for now. Over the following days, the strange design around the Renfrew cabin began to take on a shape that even Isaiah's neighbors, had they slowed their wagons long enough to study it, would have been forced to admit was not the work of a madman. The outer ring, the one closest to the wagon road, the one that faced the northern pass, was made of lodgepole pine. Isaiah had gone as far as the upper creek to find them, hauling them back one at a time on the sled through the freezing dawns. They stood taller than the spruce, and he set them nearly 9 feet apart in some places, with narrower gaps where the land dipped and the wind was likely to gather speed. Their job, he told Cordelia one evening, was not to stop the wind but to lift it, to force the first hard current upward, over the roofline entirely, before it ever reached the inner rings. Inside the outer pine ring, some 15 feet closer to the cabin, Isaiah planted what he began to call the middle band. These were the spruce, younger, denser, with branches that started lower on the trunk and held their needles through the coldest months. He set them roughly 5 feet apart, closer than the pines but not so close that they formed a solid wall. Their job, he told Josephine one afternoon while she carried pegs behind him, was to catch whatever wind slipped under the lifted current and to cut it into ribbons. "Think of it like a comb, Josie," he said, kneeling beside her in the frost. "The wind wants to be a river. We're teaching it to be 100 little streams instead, and 100 little streams can't push snow the way a river can." Josephine considered this with the grave seriousness of a 6-year-old who has been given an important truth. Then she nodded and handed him another peg. Closer still to the cabin, closer than either Coulter Vance or any other passing traveler would have thought sensible, Isaiah planted a third and final ring. These were the smallest of the saplings, thick young cedar barely taller than Josephine herself, set nearly 3 feet apart in a tight, uneven arc. He called them the sweepers. Whatever wind still had breath in it after passing the pines, and the spruce would meet the cedars last, and the cedars would take that last breath and scatter it into eddies too small and too tired to build a drift against the cabin wall. But it was the space between the 3 rings that mattered most, and that was the part Isaiah kept adjusting even after the saplings themselves were in the ground. Between the outer pines and the middle spruce, he left a corridor of open earth nearly 10 feet wide. Between the spruce and the inner cedars, he left another corridor, narrower but still deliberate. And in the innermost space, the ring of ground that lay between the sweepers and the cabin itself, he left almost 15 feet of open air. Cordelia, watching from the porch one bright cold afternoon, finally understood what her husband had been trying to describe to her at the plank table. The trees were not the shelter. The empty space between them was the shelter. The trees were only the shape of the machine that would carve that empty space out of the storm. Not every opening between the trees was where a passerby might have expected. Isaiah left one wider gap on the southeastern side of the outer ring, angled deliberately away from the cabin door, so that any snow pressure that built up inside the corridor would have somewhere to release itself sideways instead of pressing back against the walls. He left another narrow slit on the western edge, aimed toward a shallow dip in the land, so that drifting powder could bleed off toward lower ground. Nothing was symmetrical. Nothing was pretty. Cordelia, who had grown up admiring the tidy hedgerows of her grandfather's farm in Pennsylvania, found herself learning to see beauty in something her eye had first mistaken for chaos. Josephine, meanwhile, had begun to memorize the trees. She named some of them. The tallest lodgepole on the northern arc she called Captain, because it stood like a soldier at the head of the line. A crooked spruce near the eastern corridor she called Grandmother, because it leaned slightly, as though listening. She would walk between the rings in her wool coat, whispering to them as she passed, telling them what her mother had made for supper or what her father had said at the plank table the night before. Isaiah, watching her from a distance one afternoon, felt something tighten in his chest that he could not quite name. The work was harder than anything he had done in his life. The good saplings did not grow near the homestead itself, where the wind had already picked the ground clean of anything ambitious. The trees Isaiah needed grew in the sheltered draws along the upper creek, nearly 3 miles away, where enough moisture reached the soil to raise a stand of young pine and spruce worth the digging. Every morning before dawn, he yoked himself to the canvas sled and walked the 3 miles out. Every evening after dusk, he walked the 3 miles back, dragging the day's harvest behind him through grass that grew stiffer with frost each passing week. He dug each sapling out by hand, using a short-handled spade he had traded a barrel of oats for the year before. He learned quickly to cut wide around the roots, taking as much of the frozen soil with him as he could carry, wrapping each root ball in strips of burlap he had soaked in the creek before dawn. A sapling with a broken root would not survive the transplant. A sapling with its soil intact might. It was slow, punishing work, and by the second week his gloves had worn through at the palms and the fingertips, and the blood he left on the burlap froze dark against the cloth before he could reach home. Cordelia said nothing about the gloves. She stitched him a new pair from an old blanket without asking, and left them folded on the plank table one morning where he would find them before dawn. He found them, and he put them on, and he did not speak of it. But that evening at supper, he laid his hand briefly over hers before he picked up his spoon, and she understood. Josephine had begun to accompany him on the shorter trips. When Isaiah was only planting saplings he had already brought home, and not hauling new ones from the creek. She was too small to do much of the digging, but she could hold a sapling steady while her father packed the earth around it, and she could carry the water bucket from the well to soak each newly planted root. She learned, without being taught, to tell the pine from the spruce by the smell of the needles crushed between her fingers. She learned to tell where her father wanted the next hole by watching the way he squinted toward the ridge before he set the peg. She learned the patience of standing very still while a man who loved her worked something out in his head that he could not yet say out loud. One afternoon, while a thin, cold wind pushed the dry grass sideways across the yard, she looked up from the half-dug hole where she was steadying a young spruce and asked her father a question she had been carrying for several days. "Papa," she said, "will the trees really keep the winter away?" Isaiah paused with the spade in his hand. He looked down at his daughter, at her small red cheeks and her wool coat that was still too big at the shoulders, and he thought about how to answer her honestly. He knelt beside her in the frozen dirt and he set the spade aside. "No, Josie," he said, "the trees can't keep the winter away. Nobody can do that. The winter's going to come whether we plant these or not." Her face fell a little and he saw it, and he laid his gloved hand gently on top of her small one. "But what the trees can do," he said, "is teach the winter where to go. Winter's like a big loud man who's angry at the whole world. If you meet him head on, he'll knock you down. But if you're clever, you can step out of his way and let him swing at empty air until he's tired. That's what these trees are going to do for us. They're going to help winter swing at empty air." Josephine thought about this a long moment. Then she nodded slowly, the way she nodded when her mother explained something at bedtime that she was not yet sure she believed but was willing to trust for now. She reached out and touched the trunk of the little spruce beside her, gently, the way she might have touched a small animal. "Grandmother won't let him hit us," she said. Isaiah swallowed hard. He picked up the spade again and turned his face slightly away, and he went back to his digging. The first true test came sooner than he had planned for. It was not yet the blizzard he was bracing himself against. That would come later, and it would come with a force he had not fully imagined. but it was strong enough to expose the weakness in any idea that had not been thought through with care. It arrived on a Thursday in the first week of November, and it announced itself the way northern storms so often did in that country, with a sudden, watchful stillness that fell across the valley just after supper. The wind died first. That was what Isaiah noticed as he stepped onto the porch to bring in the last armload of firewood before dark. All afternoon there had been a steady breeze out of the northwest, the kind that pushed the dry grass sideways in long rippling waves and made the young pines lean gently against their guy wires. Then, sometime between the end of supper and the washing of the plates, the breeze had simply stopped, not slackened, stopped. The valley outside the cabin door had gone as quiet as the inside of a church. Isaiah stood on the porch a long moment with the firewood balanced against his hip, and he listened. Somewhere very far off, up past the northern pass, he thought he could hear a low, steady hum, like a distant train that had not yet come into view. He did not go back into the cabin right away. He set the wood down on the porch, and he walked out into the yard in his shirt sleeves, and he looked up. The sky above Willow Fork Valley had turned the color of a rifle barrel. Not black, not gray, but that flat metallic pewter that old men on the frontier had learned to read the way sailors read the sea. The clouds were moving, but they were moving slowly, and they were moving in the wrong direction, sliding south when they should have been sliding east. Isaiah stood in the yard for perhaps 2 minutes without moving. Then he went back inside, and he told Cordelia to bring in every bucket of water she could carry from the well before full dark. The storm broke over the valley shortly after midnight. It did not begin gently. There was no soft snowfall, no gradual thickening of the air. There was a single deep concussion of wind against the cabin's northern wall, hard enough to rattle the tin cup on the washstand, and then the world outside the shutters became a howling white thing that had no shape and no direction. Josephine woke crying. Cordelia gathered her up and sat beside the stove with the child pressed against her shoulder, murmuring something low and steady that Isaiah could not quite hear over the roar of the wind. Isaiah himself sat by the shuttered window with a lantern turned low, listening. Not to the wind, to the trees. At first, everything was working the way he had hoped. He could hear the outer pines groaning as they took the first shoulder of the storm, and he could hear the sound of the wind change as it climbed over them, a higher, thinner note, as though the storm had been forced onto its tiptoes. Beyond the pines, in the corridor between the outer and middle rings, he could hear the deep whumping impact of snow beginning to pile against the frozen earth in exactly the place he had meant it to pile. For nearly half an hour he allowed himself to believe. Then the wind shifted. It was a small shift, no more than 15 or 20 degrees to the west, but it was enough. Isaiah felt it before he heard it. The pressure against the northern wall of the cabin changed its quality. It stopped feeling like a steady shoulder pressing against the logs and started feeling like a fist, striking and releasing, striking and releasing. He rose from his chair and pressed his ear against the shutters. Then he heard it. On the far side of the cabin, where the goat shed stood tucked against the eastern arc of the middle spruce, there was a new sound. A hollow, rushing sound, thin and fast, like water pouring through a narrow spout. He knew what it meant before his mind had time to name it. Somewhere in the outer ring, a section had been planted too evenly, and the westward shift in the wind had found that section and turned it into a channel. Instead of scattering the current, that section was now funneling it, accelerating it, and driving it around the cabin toward the goat shed with the concentrated force of a river squeezed through a mill sluice. Isaiah reached for his coat. "Isaiah, no." Cordelia's voice was low but sharp. Josephine had gone quiet against her shoulder, her small eyes wide in the lamplight. "You cannot go out there." He paused with the coat halfway over his shoulders. He looked at his wife across the small, dim room, at the child in her arms, at the low glow of the lantern he had turned down to save oil. He knew she was right, and he knew he could not stay. If the funnel he was hearing was as strong as it sounded, the goat shed would be gone by morning, and the 2 milk goats with it. That was not what frightened him most. What frightened him was what would happen when the wind, having spent itself against the goat's shelter and blown that shelter apart, came looking for the next thing to throw itself against. And the next thing would be the cabin's eastern wall. "I have to see it, Delia," he said quietly. "I have to see what it's doing, or I can't fix it come dawn." She did not answer. She only pulled Josephine closer and turned her face toward the stove. He tied one end of a length of hemp rope to the iron bracket beside the door, and the other end around his own waist. He pulled his hat down as low as it would go, tucked a wool scarf across his mouth and nose, and pushed the door open. The wind came into the cabin like something alive and angry. Cordelia gasped. Josephine buried her face in her mother's shoulder. Isaiah forced himself out into the storm and pulled the door shut behind him with both hands. He could not see the goat shed. He could not see the porch rail 3 feet from his face. The world beyond the doorway had become a whirling white nothing that stung his eyes even through his squint. He took hold of the rope with one hand and began to work his way along the eastern wall of the cabin, feeling for the logs with his gloved fingers, letting the rope pay out behind him. The cold cut through his coat as though the coat were paper. Within a minute his eyelashes had frozen. Within 2 his beard had crusted white. He kept moving. At the eastern corner of the cabin he stopped and listened again. The rushing sound was louder here, and now he could feel the current of it, a hard, narrow river of wind slicing past the cabin's corner at chest height, driving snow in front of it so densely that when he reached out his glove into the flow, the snow packed against his palm within seconds. He knew, in that moment, exactly where the failure was. It was in a stretch of the outer pine ring about 30 paces to the northeast, where he had planted 3 saplings in an almost perfect line, because the ground there was even and the digging had been easy. He had known at the time that it was too regular. He had told himself he would come back and adjust it. He had not come back. He worked his way along the rope another 20 feet toward the shed, until he could just make out the dark shape of it through the whirling snow. The shed was still standing. The goats, he could hear, were still alive. One of them was bleating in short, frightened bursts that carried through the walls. But the drift on the northern side of the shed had already climbed to the height of the door latch, and it was climbing fast. If the wind held on this course for another 2 hours, the shed would be buried past the roofline. He had a choice to make, and he had perhaps a minute to make it. He could try to reach the outer pine ring in the middle of the storm, in this whiteout, without a rope long enough to carry him there, and try to bend or break or pull the 3 offending saplings out of their line so that the funnel would collapse. Or he could turn around, follow his rope back to the cabin, and wait for dawn, and hope the shed and the goats and the eastern wall of his home would still be there when dawn came. He stood in the roaring white dark for perhaps 10 seconds. Then he turned around and began working his way back along the rope toward the cabin door. There would be no reaching the outer ring in this. A man who tried it would be found in April, if he was found at all, sitting against a snowdrift with his rope still tangled around his frozen hands. He came back into the cabin with snow packed into every seam of his coat and ice crusted along the edge of his scarf. Cordelia was on her feet before he had the door closed, prying the frozen fabric away from his mouth with fingers that shook harder than she wanted him to see. She said nothing. She did not need to. He met her eyes once briefly, and then bent to unlace his boots with hands that would not quite obey him. The storm ran for another 16 hours. He did not sleep. He sat by the shuttered window with the lantern turned so low that the wick barely glowed, and he listened to the wind reshape itself against his cabin, the way a man listens to the breathing of a sick child. The hollow rushing sound near the eastern corner came and went as the wind shifted and shifted again. Twice he heard the deep thump of something heavy, a snapped sapling, he thought, collapsing under drift weight somewhere in the outer ring. Once near dawn, he heard the goat shed door slam against its frame, and he braced himself for the sound of the roof going with it. The roof held. Barely. When the storm finally broke, sometime near the middle of the following afternoon, Isaiah pulled on his coat again and went out to see what was left of his year's work. The eastern arc of the outer pine ring had been savaged. 2 of the 3 saplings he had planted in that too-even line were snapped clean at the base. their trunks bent nearly flat and half buried in packed snow. The third was still upright, but leaning at an angle that meant its roots had torn loose in the frozen ground. The drift behind them stretched all the way to the wall of the goat shed, chest-high in some places, and the shed itself had lost 2 shingles from its northern eave. Beyond that stretch of damage, however, around the rest of the cabin, along the northern and western arcs of the outer ring, and everywhere the corridors of empty space had done their work, the snow lay in strange low humps and shallow ridges, none of it pressing against the cabin walls, none of it climbing higher than a man's knee within the innermost ring. The system had worked, except where it had not. Isaiah stood in the snow for a long time looking at the broken saplings. Then he went to the woodshed for his spade and he began to dig. He spent the next 3 days rebuilding. He pulled the 2 snapped saplings out of the frozen ground and set new ones in wider, staggered positions, angling them so that the wind, when it next came from the northwest, would meet not a line but a scatter. He shifted the third leaning sapling 6 feet to the south and re-anchored it with a hemp guy line tied to a peg he drove into the earth with the flat of his mallet. He walked the entire outer ring, section by section, and wherever he found 3 saplings that had grown into anything resembling a straight line, he pulled one and moved it. Wherever he found a gap that looked too clean, he planted a new sapling to break it. He did not stop until the ring, viewed from any angle, looked as irregular as the wild pine thicket he had walked around outside the prospector's shack 10 years before. Cordelia brought him meals on a tin plate and set them on the porch, because she had learned by now that he would not come inside to eat until the light failed. Josephine, muffled to the eyes in her wool coat, followed him from stake to stake with the water bucket and did not ask questions. She had watched the storm from her mother's arms, and she had heard the sound of the wind against the cabin walls, and she had understood, in the way small children sometimes understand things without being told, that her father was no longer building a garden. Her father was fighting something, and the trees were how he fought it. On the 4th morning after the storm, Coulter Vance's freight wagon appeared again on the wagon road. He slowed as he passed the Renfrew claim. He did not stop, but Isaiah, kneeling beside a newly planted sapling near the eastern arc, felt the freight hauler's eyes on him for a long moment before the wagon moved on. The great blizzard came in the 3rd week of December. It arrived, as the November storm had arrived, with that same watchful stillness, the wind falling away sometime after supper, the sky above the valley taking on the color of a rifle barrel, the distant hum from the northern pass that only men who had heard it before could name. Isaiah knew what he was hearing this time. He filled every bucket in the house before dark. He carried the last of the split firewood into the innermost corridor between the sweeper cedars and the cabin, stacking it beneath the eaves where the drift would not reach it. He braced the goat shed door with a second timber and led both milk goats inside the cabin itself, tethering them near the stove where Josephine could keep them calm. Cordelia, 7 months along now, her back aching from the weight she carried, watched him work without a word. When he finally came inside and barred the door behind him, she laid her hand against his cold cheek and said only, "We're ready, Isaiah." He nodded. He did not trust himself to answer. The blizzard fell on Willow Fork Valley that night with a fury that would be spoken of in that country for the next 50 years. It ran for 4 days. It buried wagon roads under drifts 12 feet deep. It sealed chimneys, collapsed barn roofs, killed livestock in shelters that had stood through every winter since the territory was opened. A German family 6 miles to the west lost their eldest son to the cold when he went out to check on the horses and could not find his way back to the door. Coulter Vance himself, caught on the wagon road when the storm hit, survived only by cutting a mule loose from his team and lying pressed against its flank in a drift for 2 nights until the wind slackened enough for him to crawl toward the nearest lantern light. Inside the Renfrew cabin, the fire did not go out. The storm made its noise against the outer rings, and the outer rings did what Isaiah had taught them to do. The wind lifted over the pines, was cut into ribbons by the spruce, was scattered into tired eddies by the cedars. Around the cabin, in the innermost corridor of empty air, the snow fell in soft, almost gentle drifts that never rose past Josephine's knees. The chimney drew clean. The goats slept. Cordelia sat by the stove with her hand resting on the low curve of her belly, and she felt the child inside her move, and she wept once quietly without letting Isaiah see. On the third night, when the storm was at its worst, and the wind above the roofline sounded like a locomotive that would never pass, Josephine crawled into her father's lap by the lantern and asked him if grandmother the crooked spruce was still standing. Isaiah told her he believed she was, and in the morning, when he finally opened the door and stepped out into the calm basin the storm had built around them, he saw that he had told her the truth. The child was born in February. A boy. They named him Silas after Cordelia's father. Coulter Vance came to the cabin in April when the drifts had finally begun to melt and the wagon roads were passable again. He did not come to apologize. Men of that country did not, as a rule. He came with a length of measuring rope in his gloved hand, and he asked Isaiah, quietly, how far apart the outer pines had been set. Isaiah told him. Coulter wrote the number down on the back of a freight bill with the stub of a pencil. Then he asked about the spruce. Then he asked about the cedars. Then he asked about the corridors of empty space, and Isaiah walked him through the rings and showed him. Within 3 years, there were 17 homesteads in the Willow Fork country ringed by staggered saplings planted in Isaiah Renfrow's pattern. Within 10, there were more than 100. Do you believe Isaiah Renfrow was a brilliant man, or was he simply a man who had learned, one cold morning above a prospector's shack, that the winter is always trying to teach us something, and that most of us are too busy fighting it to listen? Let us know in the comments below. And if this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe for more forgotten tales from the ways of the West. Peace.